That's right. It's a real honor to be invited back to speak to the conference here at ICT. This is, I believe, my 8th time at the conference, would be 9. I had to be away because of a conflict last year, but I've been coming otherwise since 2005. And I'd like to thank Dr. Reichman, the president of IDC, and my friend Boaz Ganor, the head of ICT. From a distance, we have watched IDC become one of the finest universities, certainly in Israel, and the finest in this region of the world in less than 20 years' time. It's an astonishing story of academic success here in Herzliya, and like their story, the story of ICT is much the same. In, 15 years, this is the 13th conference, this entity is worldwide known as one of the most excellent places for the study of counterterrorism. It's just a remarkable development. I'm very proud to be a partner of ICT as we go forward. Good news, couple of things. One, I have slides, so I'm not going to say anything based on the last mark. I dislike the slides too, but I'll confess that I've put this talk together in only the last few days, and I figured I had to write it down somehow to remember what it is I was going to talk about regarding Syria. I had a nice talk on targeted killing and drones, and a few weeks ago I thought, well, maybe I better put that aside and talk about the Snowden leaks and their implications for international counterterrorism. So I had that talk all worked up, and then August 21 rolled around and the chemical attacks in Syria and what President Obama started to say and other world leaders, and I thought that it was probably important for me to say a few things about Syria from the point of view of the law. I understand that the law isn't the only game in town here when it comes to deciding what to do about Syria or deciding what to do about counterterrorism, but I think everyone in this room, lawyers and non-lawyers alike, will agree that the law is important. We all follow the rule of law, and we all regard it as a guiding light for us in setting our counterterrorism policies, establishing norms in the area. And one of the reasons that it's so very important to all of us is that those same principles are not respected by the terrorists. We fight by the rules, and we will play and win by the rules. So as we think about a critical case such as Syria, it's at least important, I think, to bear the legal principles in mind. So the punchline of the talk I'm going to give, for those of you who saw the slides and figured you could take a nap, stay awake for another 15 seconds and then you're good to go. I'd say right now that the United States, particularly President Obama, because he's stuck his neck out about red lines, but all of us in the international community who are outraged at Syrian actions in this regard are hooked on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, we are determined to take action against the regime in Syria and to use the grounds of intervention based on humanitarian principles that will strengthen the existence of a potential basis for international legal intervention at international law. If we do it, the United States alone, the United States and France, or whoever else might join us, we will be taking strong action. The downside risk of doing so is that we will create in the minds of others with whom we might disagree in the future a basis for taking action in other situations. This is a justification for action, humanitarian intervention, that is not now well established in international law. It's actually more established by the failures to act in recent decades than by positive action. If the international community or the United States alone takes that action now on the basis of international humanitarian intervention, I believe that the positive way to do it is through transparent recognition of that very justification for action and careful deliberation of the willingness to accept the consequences of other actions in the international community. So, slides. What do I just do? Hit enter? Yes. We all know about this ongoing civil war. I won't belabor the facts. This is a horrific civil war in Syria. The refugee population is staggering. The number of deaths is staggering. And we also know about the Assad chemical weapons program. It's the largest program in the region. They've used these WMD against their own people. In the August 21 attack, I didn't bring video. You've seen this, many of you. It's very difficult to watch. Hundreds, if not more than 1,000, were killed, including hundreds of children. There are wide-ranging differences on the assessments offered by different groups here, from the UN to the US to the English and the French and others. But there's compelling evidence that the Assad regime was directly involved not only in the planning, but the execution and after-action attempts to cover up what they did. Since then, the law violations have been tallied up. They've been tallied up in many different ways. Syria's actions violate the United Nations Charter. They violate the Geneva Conventions. They violate various chemical weapons instruments, including the earlier Hague Protocol. The problem with the 1993 CWC, which of course is the major international convention forbidding the use of chemical weapons, is that Syria is not a signatory. Still, in the years since the CWC, the international community has firmly come to a customary law norm understanding that it is prohibitive to use chemical weapons in any armed conflict, international or non-international armed conflict. That's been ratified by nations as recently as 2010 as part of the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction. In other words, Syria has violated international law. The problem with the international law violations involving the use of chemical weapons is that remedies do not include the use of force. There are none that are tied to violations for the use of chemical weapons. So, what happens? The Obama administration has taken what might be thought of as a Jekyll and Hyde approach to the problem. When Obama was a candidate for president in 2008, here's what he said. The president lacks power under the Constitution. He's, of course, now talking about domestic law in the U.S. Lacks power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation. Well, fast forward 3 years, Obama in 2011, he intervened with military force in Libya without congressional authorization, but there, following a UN Security Council resolution that did support military action. As you know, there has been and will be no such UN Security Council resolution authorizing military action against Syria. Then last year, we had the Obama statement about the red line involving Syria and chemical weapons. He did threaten military action after the 21 August attacks. He was supported almost immediately by the French, not inevitably by the British after a lengthy debate inside the Parliament, focused, by the way, on the doctrine of humanitarian intervention. It was a very thoughtful debate with lots of content debated concerning the scope of the humanitarian intervention rationale, nor was there support forthcoming from the Security Council. We know about the inevitable Russian veto in this case. So, he seeks congressional authorization. Many were surprised in the United States, and to the extent that people outside the United States pay attention to this, many were surprised everywhere that the president went to Congress to seek their authorization for the use of military force against Syria, looking for the equivalent of an AUMF, the action that Congress undertook a few days after 9/11, giving the president all necessary and appropriate force to go after those responsible for that horrific event. Now, why did he do it? One possibility is that he was advised that he had to. Because of his statement in 2008, there's a recognition among many of us in the United States that the only time that the president can use force on his own, that is unilaterally, is when the United States has been attacked, when he is defending as commander-in-chief. You cannot constitute Syrian CW actions against its people as an attack upon the United States or even on its allies. So the self-defense rationale doesn't work. It may be too, and this may be an more important rationale for those advising the president, if he gets congressional support, he will have a stronger position, domestically and internationally. The United States will be speaking with one voice, but one voice based on all of the leaders of our elected branches. Now, if you're following the debate at all, he's got some difficulties domestically in the United States. He appears to have a thin margin of support in the U.S. Senate. The Foreign Relations Committee approved a resolution last week by a vote of 10-7. Senators on the Republican side, a couple of them supporting him, Senator McCain, Senator Graham, very important supporters of the president. Yesterday, or whenever I was in the airport, when I fly over here, I lose track of time. General Petraeus came out in support of President Obama's posture in this case and lent strong support to the initiative. But there's a considerable debate yet to be had in the House of Representatives where the Democrats are not in the majority and Republicans may well hold sway. And even on a nonpartisan basis, I think the president could be in trouble here. Might he go forward anyway? Yes, he might. But it would be very difficult. It would be very difficult for him legally. I think on domestic law, he would be walking on thin ice. Politically, he would have his legs cut out from under him and would have very little political strength after launching an operation. If Congress actually acted to prohibit him from going forward without coming back to them for authorization, his legal chances in domestic law would even be smaller, virtually none. There's also the problem in domestic law that because there's no Security Council resolution in this case, he might be acting in violation of the UN Charter, which forbids a violation of the territorial integrity of any state in Article 2. So, what will Congress do? When I wrote this, I think the last time I touched it was probably Saturday. I thought some form of authorization is likely. I guess I'm going to stick with that, but I'm not sure. I have no high degree of confidence here. There have been various questions raised among our elected representatives. What's the objective of military action? His draft authorization is very imprecise in that regard. What's the permissible scope of it in intensity and duration? How heavy will the hit be? For how many days will it go on? Will there ever be ground forces? So far he has said no. Will there be a need for rescue operations? And if so, what might their scope be? If Assad strikes back with additional CW or some other form of WMD, would additional strikes by the United States be permitted? If he retaliates against allies in the region, what will the United States do? And then there's the money question. There's something called sequestration. Many of you know that word. It's become a verb and a noun and an adjective. It has a lot of presence in the United States. If the president does more than lob a few dozen missiles over the course of a couple of days, he may be forced to come back to Congress for additional funding to do additional military action, raising, again, a need to get affirmative approval. Not an easy thing. It's unclear now what form the authorization might take. It's not going to be, if it comes at all, it won't be as broadly stated as the 2001 AUMF. There's likely to be a restriction on ground forces unless he comes back and asks separately for them. The bills that are out there now in the House and the Senate talk about 60 days with a possible request for an additional 30. There's some talk about limiting the kinds of weapons that might be used, and all of them, of course, require some reporting to Congress. Here is the Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dempsey and Secretary of Defense Hagel and Secretary of State Kerry in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week. International law problem, of course, is that there are only two ways classically to use force in international law. One is a Security Council resolution. We know that's a non-starter in this case. The second is in individual or collective self-defense. That can't happen here either for the reasons that I've given. Third, problem on our side of the water is that neither the president nor his advisors nor members of Congress have barely mentioned international law in the debates over there. That's very discouraging. Leaving the third possibility, humanitarian intervention. Sometimes this is called R2P. I distinguish R2P from international humanitarian intervention. R2P is a political doctrine of reflecting moral paradigms and moral mandates. Humanitarian intervention is its legal cousin. And if we go there, as I said at the very outset, we might be striking out new. There are those who would have justification under international law for striking Syria. Turkey, of course, has done a little bit of skirmishing back and forth across the border. NATO, if it was defending Turkey. Israel, we've seen 4 times this year going after convoys who are thought to be taking advanced weaponry to Hezbollah. All of those things remain possible. I'm going quickly because I see I've used my time. And then finally, the precedent of Kosovo. President Bill Clinton did in Kosovo what President Obama is threatening to do in Syria, more or less, more than a decade ago. He ordered airstrikes in '99. The parallels to the current situation are fairly striking. Heavy refugee flow, lots of risk of regional destabilization. There was a coalition of nations aligned. There were serious violations of international law being perpetrated by the Milosevic regime. Nor did the Security Council get in to authorize military action then. NATO did, but NATO had no international law authority to authorize an operation out of its region. When Congress got involved in the domestic side in March of '99, to make a longer story short, they sat on their hands. They did not authorize or forbid what the president did. The president went ahead and did the bombing for 2 months. At the end of 2 months, Clinton came back for some more money to fill the coffers of the accounts that were being used to undertake the bombing, and Congress approved the appropriation about a week before the bombing ended. So legally, they ratified what the president had been doing for 2 weeks. Ironically, that could happen here. The president could go forward. He may run out of money. He may have to come back for more money. Congress may approve the money and in a backhanded way may legitimate after the fact what he's done on his own. There is a legitimacy case here. And it seems to me if the international community is going to strike out at Assad for what he's done, we have to stake out the case about the legitimacy of the military action. And by staking out the legitimacy, we lend credence to its lawfulness. A rule of law approach can succeed in this regime. It's a precarious one for the reasons that I mentioned at the outset. But I think we can strengthen a case for humanitarian intervention if we're very clear about what it is we do. Thanks very much.